Captain James Reynolds had been flying medical transports through deep space for 12 years, and he thought he'd seen everything. But when the distress beacon lit up his console that Tuesday afternoon, something felt different. The signal was coming from near a collapsing star system, right on the edge of Valthene territory. His co-pilot, Tyler, immediately pulled up the regulations on his screen. "Jim, that's a royal escape pod," Tyler said, his voice tight with worry. "Valthene royalty. You know what happens if we get involved with their internal affairs." James did know. The Valthene Empire had exactly one rule for outsiders: stay away from royal business or face execution. No trial, no appeal, just death. They were powerful enough to enforce it too. 3 years ago, a cargo ship had accidentally witnessed a royal ceremony, and the entire crew had simply disappeared. But James was looking at the bio readings from that pod, and they were dropping fast. Someone was dying in there. "How long until the wormhole collapses completely?" he asked. 20 minutes, maybe less, his navigator Lisa answered from the back. "If we're going to do something stupid, we need to decide now." James stared at the screen. The smart choice was obvious. Turn around, file a report, let the Valthene handle their own problems. He had a wife back on Earth Station 3. He had a daughter starting college. He had every reason to fly away. His finger hovered over the course correction button. "Damn it," he muttered, and turned the ship toward the beacon. "Tyler, prep the medical bay. Lisa, plot us the fastest escape route once we grab them. And somebody say a prayer, because we're about to do something really, really stupid." The rescue itself took 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours. The escape pod was spinning wildly, caught in the gravitational pull of the collapsing star. James had to match its rotation, extend the docking clamp, and pull them in before the whole thing got sucked into oblivion. His hands were steady on the controls, but sweat dripped down his back. When they finally got the pod secured and opened the hatch, James rushed inside with his medical kit. The scene made him freeze for just a second. The Valthene inside was young, maybe equivalent to a human teenager. Her skin had the characteristic blue-silver shimmer of Valthene royalty, but something was wrong. Her lower body was encased in what looked like a mobility frame, except it was sparking and broken, pieces of it scattered around the pod. She was conscious, barely. When she saw James, her eyes went wide with something that looked like terror. "No," she whispered in heavily accented English. "No, you cannot see me like this. You must leave. Please." James ignored her protests and started checking her vital signs. "Not happening. You're hurt, and I'm a medic. Now stay still while I figure out what's going on." "You do not understand," she said, her voice getting stronger even as her body trembled. "I am Princess Kira of the Valthene High Court. My frame is damaged. You have seen my weakness. When my mother finds out, she will execute you and your entire crew." "We'll worry about that later," James said, working quickly to stabilize her. Her biology was different from humans, but he trained on Valthene physiology. The basics were the same: keep the blood flowing, keep the organs functioning, keep them alive. Tyler helped him move her to their medical bay. As they worked, James noticed something. The princess's mobility frame wasn't just damaged, it had been cheaply made in the first place. Like someone had built it to barely function, hoping maybe it would fail at a convenient time. Over the next 2 days, while his ship raced away from Valthene space, James learned the truth. Princess Kira had been born with underdeveloped legs. In Valthene culture, physical disability in royalty wasn't just unfortunate, it was considered a shameful curse. She'd been kept hidden away her entire life, rarely allowed to leave the palace, given minimal support equipment. "The frame failing was supposed to be my honorable end," she explained quietly on the second day. "A convenient accident. My mother could mourn appropriately without the embarrassment of a defective daughter." James felt anger rising in his chest. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "It is our way," Kira said sadly. "Well, your way is wrong," James replied. He spent the next day building her a proper mobility frame from spare parts in his engineering bay. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. More importantly, he made sure Kira understood how to maintain it, modify it, improve it. During those 2 days, something unexpected happened. Kira started talking to the crew, and they discovered she was brilliant. She helped Lisa solve a navigation problem that had been bugging her for months. She discussed music theory with Tyler and actually made recommendations that improved his compositions. She was funny, curious, and sharp as hell. On the 3rd day, the sensors lit up. 30 Valthene warships had surrounded them. "Well," James said quietly, "I guess we're about to meet your mother." Kira's face went pale. Captain Reynolds, I am so sorry. You saved my life, and now you will die for it. But James just squeezed her hand. Hey, you're worth it. Remember that. The Valthene flagship appeared on their view screen like a nightmare made of metal and light. It was easily 50 times the size of James's medical transport, bristling with weapons that could turn his little ship into dust in seconds. Tyler's hands were shaking on the controls as the communication channel crackled to life. Human vessel, you will power down all systems and prepare for boarding. Any resistance will result in immediate destruction. James nodded to Tyler, who slowly shut down their engines. Within minutes, they heard the heavy clang of docking clamps attaching to their hull. The sound of boots on metal echoed through the corridors, getting closer. James gathered his crew in the main cabin, positioning himself in front of them protectively. When the airlock door opened, 20 Valthene soldiers poured in, their weapons raised. They moved with perfect precision, securing every corner of the ship in seconds. Then she entered. Queen Myra was tall, even for a Valthene, standing nearly 7 feet. Her skin shimmered with patterns that James's translator chip identified as markers of extreme anger and authority. She wore armor that looked ceremonial but deadly, and her eyes swept across the human crew like she was deciding which one to kill first. Where is my daughter? Her voice was cold enough to freeze stars. Mother. Kira rolled forward in her human-made mobility frame, her head held high despite the fear James could see in her eyes. The Queen's gaze snapped to her daughter, and something flickered across her face. Shock? Shame? James couldn't quite read it. For a long moment, mother and daughter just stared at each other across the cabin. Then Queen Myra stepped forward and did something that surprised everyone. She gently touched Kira's face, examining her as if checking for injuries. You are well? The Queen asked quietly. Yes, Mother. Captain Reynolds saved my life. The Queen's expression hardened again. She straightened and turned to James. You and your crew will accompany me to my flagship. There are matters that must be addressed formally. It wasn't a request. Within an hour, James and his team found themselves being escorted through corridors that screamed wealth and power. The walls were lined with what looked like precious metals, and every Valthene they passed stopped and bowed deeply as the Queen walked by. They eventually entered a massive hall that could have fit 3 of James's ships inside it. The room was filled with Valthene military commanders, all in elaborate uniforms, all staring at the humans with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. At the far end of the hall stood an enormous throne, carved from a single piece of dark crystal that seemed to absorb light. Queen Myra walked to her throne but didn't sit. Instead, she stood before it, Princess Kira beside her in the mobility frame James had built. The Queen gestured, and the guards forced James forward until he stood alone in the center of the hall, surrounded by hundreds of alien eyes. Captain James Reynolds of Earth, Queen Myra's voice echoed through the chamber. You have interfered in royal Valthene affairs. You have witnessed what was meant to remain hidden. You have violated our most sacred protocols. James felt his heart pounding, but he kept his voice steady. Yes, Your Majesty. I have. You understand that the penalty for such violations is death. Not just for you, but for your entire crew. Tyler made a small noise behind him, but James didn't turn around. I understand. The Queen's skin patterns shifted to something darker, more complex. Then you also understand that you should have left my daughter to die. It would have been an honorable end for her. Clean. Appropriate for one born with her deficiencies. James felt anger flare in his chest, but he forced it down. Getting angry wouldn't help his crew. I understand that's what your culture believes, yes. And yet you chose to save her anyway. To build her that crude device. To expose her weakness to your entire crew. The Queen's voice was rising now, filling the hall. Why? Why would you commit such a foolish act, knowing it would cost you everything? The hall fell absolutely silent. Every eye in the room was locked on James. He could hear his own breathing, feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. One wrong word and they were all dead. But looking at Kira, standing there in the frame he'd built, he realized he didn't care about finding the right political answer. He was going to tell the truth. Your Majesty, James said clearly. You asked me why I saved your daughter. But I think that's the wrong question. A ripple of shock went through the assembled commanders. No one spoke to the Queen like that. No one contradicted her. But Queen Myra raised a hand, silencing any objections. Then what is the right question, human? James took a breath. The right question is why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't anyone? The Queen's skin patterns flickered with confusion. Explain. Because she's a person, James said simply. Because when I found her, she was fighting with everything she had to stay alive. Because she wanted to live. Isn't that enough? She is defective, the Queen said, but there was something strange in her voice now. Something that almost sounded like she was asking a question instead of making a statement. No, James said firmly. She's different. Where I come from, we learned a long time ago that different doesn't mean less. It just means different. He could feel the entire room holding its breath. This was it. This was the moment where he either got through to her or got himself and his crew killed. He decided to go all in. Your Majesty, may I tell you what your daughter did during the 2 days she was on my ship? Queen Myra's expression was unreadable. Speak. And so James did. He told them everything. James stepped closer to the center of the hall, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. Every Valthene commander was watching him like he was either the bravest or stupidest creature they'd ever seen. Maybe both. On the first day, James began, while I was building her mobility frame, Princess Kira noticed I was having trouble with the power coupling. The energy flow kept fluctuating, and I couldn't figure out why. She watched me struggle for maybe 10 minutes before she quietly suggested I reverse the polarity on the secondary circuit. He paused, looking at Kira, who was staring at the floor. I've been an engineer for 15 years, Your Majesty. And your daughter spotted a solution in 10 minutes that I'd missed completely. She was right, by the way. Fixed the problem instantly. One of the Valthene commanders shifted uncomfortably, but Queen Myra's face remained unreadable. Continue, she said. On the second day, my navigator Lisa was working on a star chart. We'd been having issues with our jump calculations through the Andia sector. Nothing dangerous, just inefficient. We were burning about 15% more fuel than we should. Lisa had been trying to solve it for 3 months. James smiled slightly. Princess Kira looked at it for 20 minutes and found a pattern in the gravitational fields that our computers had missed. She saw it with her mind, Your Majesty. She just saw it. Cut our fuel consumption by 18%. Tyler spoke up from behind him, his voice nervous but determined. She also helped me with my music composition, Your Majesty. I've been working on a piece for my daughter's wedding, and I was stuck. The princess listened to it once and suggested a harmonic progression I'd never considered. It was perfect. My daughter cried when she heard the final version. James watched Queen Myra's face carefully. Something was changing in her expression, tiny cracks appearing in that imperial mask. He pressed forward. But that's not even the most important part, James said. You want to know what really impressed me? It was watching her adapt. She'd spent her whole life with equipment that barely worked, equipment that I think was designed to fail. And when I gave her something better, something reliable, she didn't just use it. She improved it. By the second day, she'd modified 3 components to work more efficiently. She taught herself our engineering systems in 48 hours. He turned to look directly at Princess Kira, then back at the Queen. Your Majesty, you called your daughter defective. But I watched her learn faster than most people I've trained. I watched her solve problems that stumped my experienced crew. I watched her create beauty through music with Tyler. I watched her laugh at Lisa's terrible jokes and ask questions about Earth that showed genuine curiosity about other cultures. James's voice grew stronger, more passionate. You know what I didn't see? I didn't see someone weak. I didn't see someone who needed to be hidden away. I saw someone brilliant who'd been told her whole life that she wasn't good enough, and who still fought every single day to prove her worth. The hall was so quiet that James could hear the hum of the ship's systems. Queen Myra's skin patterns were shifting rapidly now, colors that James's translator couldn't quite interpret. But he wasn't done yet. We humans have a saying, Your Majesty. We say that disability isn't about what someone can't do. It's about recognizing that everyone does things differently, and that's okay. Your daughter's legs don't work the way yours do. So what? Her mind works brilliantly. Her heart is kind. Her spirit is unbreakable. He gestured around the hall at all the assembled commanders. I see a room full of warriors who can walk and run and fight. That's valuable, sure. But how many of them could have survived what Princess Kira has survived? Growing up knowing her own family was ashamed of her? Living with equipment designed to fail? And still maintaining the grace and kindness she showed my crew? One of the commanders made a sound of protest, but Queen Myra silenced him with a single look. Her skin patterns were shifting faster now, and James realized she was struggling to maintain her composure. You asked me why I saved her, James said quietly. But honestly, Your Majesty, I think she saved herself. She survived that pod failure. She fought to stay conscious until help arrived. She refused to give up. All I did was give her the tools she deserved to have in the first place. He took a step forward, knowing he was probably crossing some kind of line but not caring anymore. You want to execute me for seeing her weakness? Fine. But you're wrong about what I saw. I didn't see weakness. I saw strength that your entire empire apparently can't recognize. His voice dropped, becoming almost gentle. And if your culture throws away people like your daughter because they are different, because they need support to move through the world, then honestly, Your Majesty, your culture is missing out on something precious. Queen Myra's hands were trembling now. James could see it, even from across the hall. The other Valthene were starting to notice too, shifting uncomfortably. Their queen, their unshakable leader, was showing emotion in public. It was clearly something that wasn't supposed to happen. She composed music, James continued softly. Did you know that? On our second day together, she heard Tyler's work and created a counter-melody that was hauntingly beautiful. She told me that music was forbidden to her because physical perfection and artistic perfection were supposed to go together in Valthene culture. She'd been teaching herself in secret for years. He looked at Kira again, who had tears streaming down her face. Your daughter is amazing, Your Majesty. And the fact that you can't see that your whole empire can't see that, doesn't make her defective. It makes you blind. The words hung in the air like a challenge. James had just insulted the queen, her culture, and every person in that room. He'd probably just guaranteed not only his death but the most painful death they could devise. But watching Queen Myra's face, he saw something he didn't expect. Her skin patterns exploded into chaos, colors swirling and clashing. Her hands went to her face. And then, in front of her entire military command, in front of hundreds of witnesses, Queen Myra of the Valthene High Court did something that James would later learn hadn't happened in recorded Valthene history. She fell to her knees and began to weep. The sound that came from Queen Myra was something James would never forget. It wasn't crying like humans cried. It was deeper, more primal, like something breaking inside her that had been held together by steel cables for far too long. Her entire body shook, and the skin patterns that had been swirling in chaos suddenly went completely dark, which James's translator identified as the Valthene equivalent of utter despair. Every single commander in that hall stood frozen. Some looked horrified, others confused, a few angry. But none of them moved. Their queen, the most powerful person in the Valthene Empire, was on her knees in front of a human, and nobody knew what to do. 7. Queen Myra's voice came out broken, barely a whisper but somehow carrying through the silent hall. Kira is my 7th child. James felt his stomach drop. He had a terrible feeling he knew where this was going. The queen's hands were pressed against the floor now, her whole body trembling. My first daughter, Nera, was born with a weak heart. She lived for 3 days before I sent her into space in an escape pod, alone, to die with honor. I held her before I did it. I sang her the lullaby my mother sang to me. And then I watched her pod drift into a star. The hall was so quiet that James could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Kira had moved her mobility frame closer to her mother, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't speak. My second child, a son named Vel, had eyes that couldn't see properly. The medical priest said it was a genetic flaw, shameful, unacceptable in royal blood. He was 2 years old. He could laugh. He knew his name. He called me Mama in our language. Queen Myra's voice cracked. I held him too, before I sent him away. I told him stories until he fell asleep, and then I put him in a pod and launched it into the void. James felt sick. Tyler behind him made a choking sound. Even the Valthene commanders were starting to show signs of distress, their skin patterns flickering. The third was another daughter. She couldn't hear. The fourth had a twisted spine. The fifth was born with only one lung that worked properly. The sixth, my beautiful boy Core, had a mind that worked differently. He couldn't speak until he was 5, and when he did speak, he said strange, wonderful things that no one understood. The queen looked up at James, and the pain in her eyes was unbearable to witness. I killed them all. Every single one. I followed our laws, our traditions, our sacred customs. And I told myself I was being strong. That I was doing what a good queen does. That their deaths had meaning, had honor. She turned her gaze to Kira, and fresh tears poured down her face. And then came Kira. My 7th child. My last chance for a perfect heir. And when she was born with legs that didn't work, I couldn't do it again. I couldn't send another child to die alone in the dark. So I kept her. I hid her. I gave her the minimum equipment necessary to move, hoping that maybe if no one looked too closely, they wouldn't notice. Queen Myra's voice rose, filled with self-hatred. But I was still ashamed. I kept her locked away. I forbade her from learning music, from studying engineering, from doing all the things she loved because I was terrified someone would see her and question my fitness to rule. I gave her equipment that barely functioned because part of me still wished she would just quietly disappear. Kira was openly sobbing now, but she rolled her frame right up to her mother and reached down to touch her shoulder. "Mother, please." "No," the Queen said sharply. "Let me finish. Let them all hear what I am." She looked back at James, and her voice became steadier, colder. "And then you came along, Captain Reynolds. A stranger. A human who knew my daughter for 2 days. 2 days. And in that time, you saw what I refused to see for 16 years. You saw her brilliance. Her kindness. Her worth. You built her proper equipment. You encouraged her gifts. You treated her like a person instead of a shameful secret." She pushed herself up to her knees, her hands clenched into fists. "You did in 2 days what I failed to do in 16 years. You loved my daughter." The word love seemed to hit the assembled commanders like a shockwave. Several of them exchanged glances, their skin patterns shifting to colors James's translator marked as extreme discomfort. Apparently, queens weren't supposed to talk about love, especially not in front of their military command. "I am the Queen of the Valthene Empire," Myra continued, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued to fall. "I command 17 star systems. I have led our people through wars and prosperity. I am supposed to be wise, strong, unbreakable." She looked around at her commanders. And yet a human medical transport captain understood something fundamental that I did not. That throwing away brilliant minds, kind hearts, and strong spirits because their bodies don't match some arbitrary standard of perfection isn't strength. It's cowardice. It's waste. One of the older commanders stepped forward, his skin patterns showing deep concern. "Your Majesty, you are not well. This human has confused you with their soft thinking. You did what our laws required. What honor demanded. There is no shame in following tradition." Queen Myra stood up slowly, and when she looked at that commander, there was something new in her eyes. Something hard and determined. "No shame? Commander Vex, you have 3 children, do you not?" The commander looked confused. "Yes, Your Majesty. All perfect, all serving in the fleet." "And if one of them had been born different? What would you have done?" The commander straightened. "I would have done my duty, Your Majesty. As you did. As every loyal Valthene does." "You would have murdered your child," the Queen said flatly. "Let's use the real word. Not honored them with a dignified end. Not released them from a life of shame. You would have taken a baby, your baby, and sent them alone into space to suffocate or freeze or burn. That's what we do. That's what we've always done." The commander's skin patterns shifted to angry red. "It is tradition. It is how we maintain the strength of our bloodlines. It's how we murder children." Queen Myra's voice thundered through the hall. "It's how we throw away genius and beauty and potential because we're too afraid to admit that strength comes in forms we didn't expect." She turned in a slow circle, addressing all the assembled commanders. "This human shamed me today. Not by showing me my daughter's weakness, but by showing me my own. My cowardice. My blindness. My willingness to murder my own children rather than question a tradition that's wrong." James watched as the Queen walked slowly to Kira and knelt down in front of her daughter's mobility frame. She reached up and cupped Kira's face in her hands. "I failed you," she whispered. "I failed all of them. And I'm so sorry." Kira leaned forward, wrapping her arms around her mother. "I forgive you," she said softly. "But mother, you need to understand something. Captain Reynolds didn't just save my life. He taught me that my life was worth saving in the first place." Queen Myra stood up slowly, still holding her daughter's hand. The tears had stopped, but her skin patterns had shifted to something James's translator couldn't quite identify. It looked like determination mixed with grief, resolve led over pain. She turned to face her assembled commanders, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "The doctrine of perfection is hereby abolished, effective immediately." The hall erupted. Commanders started shouting over each other, their skin patterns flashing angry reds and oranges. Some were yelling about tradition, others about the law, a few about the gods themselves. The noise was deafening. Queen Myra raised her hand, and gradually, reluctantly, the hall fell silent again. I am not finished, she said coldly. We will begin an immediate search of all known space within our territory. Every abandoned child, every royal or noble offspring sent away for being different, if they survived, we will find them. We will bring them home. Commander Vex stepped forward again, his whole body radiating fury. Your Majesty, this is madness. You cannot overturn thousands of years of tradition because one human made you feel guilty. The doctrine of perfection has kept our bloodline strong, our empire powerful. Without it, we will weaken, we will fall. We are already weak, Queen Myra shot back. We throw away brilliant minds like my daughters because we're too stupid to recognize genius when it doesn't come in the package we expect. How many engineers have we lost? How many scientists, artists, leaders? How many children who could have changed our empire for the better died alone in the dark because we were too proud to admit that different doesn't mean less? Another commander, a younger woman named Keth, spoke up. Her voice was calmer but no less opposed. Your Majesty, even if we wanted to implement such a change, the other noble houses will never accept it. They will see this as weakness. There will be challenges to your rule. Let them come, Queen Myra said simply. Any house that wants to continue murdering children can challenge me directly. I welcome it. The hall went silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Threatening. Dangerous. James could see it happening in real time. The empire was fracturing right in front of him. Some commanders were nodding slowly, their skin patterns showing agreement or at least consideration. Others looked like they were ready to start a war right there in the throne room. Commander Vex drew himself up to his full height. Then I must respectfully resign my commission, Your Majesty. I cannot serve a queen who abandons the principles that made our empire great. And I am not alone. He looked around the room. Those who stand with tradition, with honor, with the true Valthine way, follow me. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, about half the commanders in the room turned and walked toward Vex. James watched in horror as the Valthine military command literally split in two, right down the middle. Families were probably being torn apart. Lifelong friendships were ending. And it was all because he'd answered one question honestly. Queen Myra watched them go, her face expressionless. When the last of the traditionalists had left, she turned to those who remained. We all know what this means. There will be civil war. Houses will choose sides. Systems will rebel. People will die. She paused, her voice softening slightly. And I am prepared to pay that price. My daughter is worth it. All our lost children are worth it. Commander Keth stepped forward. Your Majesty, if we're going to do this, we need help. We need to learn how to actually support these children we're going to search for. We need technology, medical knowledge, cultural understanding. She glanced at James. We need humans. James felt every eye in the room turn to him. He held up his hands. Whoa, hold on. I'm just a transport captain. I'm not qualified to restructure an entire empire. You're qualified enough, Queen Myra said, and there was something almost like a smile on her face. You understood in minutes what we failed to grasp in millennia. Captain Reynolds, I am formally requesting that you and your crew remain as advisors to the Valthine Reformation. We need people who see disability as diversity, not deficit. We need your perspective. Tyler spoke up from behind James. Sir, we have families. Jobs. Lives back on Earth. James knew Tyler was right. This wasn't their fight. They'd already done more than enough just by saving Kira. Going home was the smart choice, the safe choice. But he looked at Princess Kira, sitting in the mobility frame he'd built, and he thought about 6 other children who died alone because nobody had been there to save them. How long are we talking? James asked. Months, at least, Queen Myra admitted. Maybe longer. The fracture will spread quickly. We need to establish new protocols, train medical staff, design better support equipment, change educational systems. It's not a small task. James looked back at his crew. Tyler looked uncertain. Lisa was frowning, thinking it through. But then Lisa nodded slowly. My sister has cerebral palsy, she said quietly. Back on Earth, she's an astrophysicist. She's brilliant. But it took humanity centuries to figure out that people like her deserved the chance to show what they could do. She looked at James. If we can help the Valthine skip a few centuries of stupidity, maybe save some lives in the process. I'm in. Tyler sighed. My wife is going to kill me. But yeah, okay. I'm in too. James turned back to Queen Myra. We'll need to contact Earth, let them know what's happening. And we'll need resources, access to your medical facilities, cooperation from your scientists. Done, the Queen said immediately. Whatever you need. The next 6 months were chaos. The civil war that everyone had predicted started within weeks. 3 star systems declared their loyalty to Commander Vex and the Traditionalist faction. Queen Myra's forces fought back, but it was brutal and costly. James and his crew tried to stay out of the military side of things, focusing instead on the humanitarian work. They helped design new mobility equipment that actually worked properly. They trained Valthene doctors on human approaches to adaptive technology. They rewrote educational materials to include disabled children instead of shaming them. And most importantly, they went on the search missions. The first child they found alive was on a barely habitable moon in the Outer Territories. He was 11 years old, had been surviving alone for 9 years after his escape pod crashed instead of burning up like it was supposed to. His name was Tor, and he was deaf. He taught himself to read, to hunt, to build shelter, all without being able to hear. When they brought him back to the capital, Queen Myra held him for an hour and didn't let go. They found 4 more over the next months. 4 children out of hundreds, maybe thousands who'd been sent away over the years. 4 survivors who'd beaten impossible odds. Each one came back to a queen who wept and apologized and promised to do better. James was there the day Princess Kira addressed the Reformed Council, speaking about her vision for a Valthene empire that valued all minds, all hearts, all forms of existence. She spoke about the children they'd lost and the ones they'd saved. She spoke about her mother's courage in admitting she was wrong. And she spoke about a human transport captain who'd seen value where an entire empire had seen only shame. 2 years after that day in the throne room, James finally went home to Earth. The Valthene Reformation was still ongoing, still messy, still incomplete. The Civil War had ended in a tense peace, with the Traditionalists controlling 2 systems but agreeing to stop executing disabled children. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. On his last day, Princess Kira came to see him off. She was using a new mobility frame now, sleek Valthene technology that incorporated everything James had taught them about adaptive design. She'd been named ambassador to Earth, the first Valthene to ever hold the position. You know, she said, I've been thinking about that day you answered my mother's question. You could have lied. You could have said something political, something safe. But you told the truth, even though it might have gotten you killed. James shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do at the time. It was the most human thing you could have done, Kira said softly. Seeing people. All of them. Exactly as they are, without judgment, without shame. Just seeing them and recognizing their worth. She smiled. You didn't just save my life that day, Captain Reynolds. You taught an entire empire how to be better. James looked out the viewport at the Valthene home world, at the empire that was slowly, painfully learning to embrace all its children. You know what the funny thing is? We humans, we're still learning too. We've made progress, sure, but we're not perfect. We still have a long way to go. Then maybe that's the real lesson, Kira said. That getting better is a journey, not a destination. That every generation has to choose to be kinder, wiser, more inclusive than the last. James smiled. Yeah. Maybe that is the most human thing of all. As his ship pulled away from the Valthene flagship, James looked back one last time. He thought about 7 children, 6 who had died and 1 who had lived. He thought about a queen who had found the courage to admit she was wrong. And he thought about how one simple act of compassion, one refusal to look away from suffering, had changed the course of an entire civilization. The galaxy was a little wider now, a little more ready to embrace all forms of life. And it had started with one question and one honest answer. That was enough.